Now, it's time for Modern Money Doughnuts with Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Modern Money Doughnuts, our show about modern monetary theory, MMT, and ecological economics. My name is Gabrielle Bond, and I am the organiser for the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group in Adelaide, South Australia, and I'm also a director of Modern Money Lab. And I'm here with my co-host, Stephen Hale. How are you going, Stephen?
It's great to see you again, Gabby. I'm adjunct associate professor at Torrens University here in Adelaide, and I'm an economist at Gabby's organisation, Modern Money Lab.
Our organisation. We're doing it together.
That's right.
With others, with a great team of people. It looks like our fabulous guest is online, so that's terrific. We have a wonderful guest joining us today. It's Dr. Sherry Wise. Now, Sherry is a regular at KRTD Media. She's also a senior economist with the US Department of Agriculture and an expert in both environmental economics and what is in the US called antitrust policy, but it's often called competition policy elsewhere. And we did have a chat about that, didn't we, Stephen, last week? Sherry was also recently on Joe Firestone's show talking about the microeconomics of inflation. You might have caught that episode. And we'll be talking about the pandemic, of course, Joe Biden, and how Sherry would change the US if she was the president.
Now,
we see if she's online?
Yeah. Well, I can see her name. That's it.
Here she
Hi,
is.
Sherry.
Thanks for joining us.
And well done for making it. I know you've had a chaotic day. I'm going to ask Sherry a question about pandemic inflation in the US in a moment, once we get connected. At the moment, I don't think she can hear us.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Sherry, can you hear us?
Okay. I can't hear anything. I'm sorry. Okay. I don't know what's wrong. Sorry.
Okay. Well, let's see whether we can fix this with Shane's help.
Okay.
If we can't, we'll talk about something else for a moment. You should leave and come back, Sherry.
Leave. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I have to leave and come back.
Yeah, don't worry. We'll talk amongst ourselves for a couple of minutes.
We've got some news actually that we'd like to tell people about. So, Stephen, you mentioned Torrens University in your introduction, as you do every week. I was last year. You were at the University of Adelaide, so it's been a bit of a change for you. Would you like to tell us the good news?
Yeah, absolutely. About a year and a half ago, Philip Lawn, who we spoke to 2 or 3 weeks back, and I started talking to Torrens University, and we started designing some MMT and ecological economics postgraduate courses, which we're going to offer to people around the world online, starting in September this year. And
one of a kind.
That's right. There's no such program anywhere in the world at the moment. And we'll be signing, I hope, so that we can start properly telling everybody about these courses by the end of this week. It's taken a year and a half to get this far. It's very, very exciting, with the support of people like Fadel Kaboub and Stephanie Kelton and many other people locally, including a guy called Con Michalakis, who is a great friend of ours and is the chief investment officer of the biggest superannuation fund in South Australia. And I can't wait to tell people more about that, but I'm not going to do it just at this moment because we've got Sherry with us.
Yay, excellent. Thank you, Sherry. How's your sound and audio?
Everything's fine now. Thank you.
Fantastic.
I don't know what happened. I guess just signing in.
No, that's all right. You're a regular. You roll with these things.
So, well, it's nice to see you again, Stephen and Gabrielle. How are you doing?
Yeah, good.
doing
We've had a
fine.
massive week since we talked to you. Feels like
Oh,
such a long time, but actually
mm-hmm,
it's only been a couple of days.
mm-hmm.
But Stephen, you
Uh,
had a questions to start out with, didn't you?
I did. Let's start with the pandemic and inflation, because the
Oh,
pandemic, of course, is a global problem, and many countries, including the one that Gabby and I are sitting in, have had big government support packages to support people and businesses during the pandemic.
mm-hmm,
But the impact on the cost of living has been thus far nowhere near as big here
mm-hmm,
as in the
Mm,
US.
mm.
mm-hmm.
What do you put the spike in US inflation down to, especially compared to other countries where there's been much less of an impact so far?
Um, I think there are multiple issues that are going
Mm,
on. For one thing, we've kind of had different issues going on, not all at the same time,
mm,
but these various issues they've kind of developed,
Mm.
and the whole end result of it has been that it kind of is now spread everywhere. And so one of the issues that we had early on was uh, we had food corporations that were especially in the meat packing industry, and I happen
Mm.
to focus on that in my job.
mm,
There we had a lot of illnesses because of the close quarters that the people work in.
mm,
Yeah, same here. We had
Yeah,
we had big problems. Mm.
yeah. And so we had a massive number of people in that industry just getting sick. And as a result, the plants were working at, much lower capacity, and the supply wasn't getting out. In fact, we had an unfortunate incidents of some animals having to be slaughtered because having to be euthanized because
Mm.
the backup in the facilities was so large that the
mm,
animals were just basically becoming too big to market. And so that was a really unfortunate situation. And
Mm.
then as time has gone on, we've had episodes of, for a while there was a period of that, there was a shortage of containers because
mm,
the ships that were bringing goods in from other places, primarily China, were they were bringing goods in containers. The containers were here, and typically in the past, what would happen is the containers would get refilled with
Mm.
something and then go back. But in fact, we had a lot of problems with crops and things like that. And so there were times when there was a real mismatch between demand and supply of the
Mm.
containers. So that created a problem. We've had all kinds of problems with trucking.
Yep.
And so that is a result of really the trucking deregulation that happened, years past. And then of course we've had multiple problems because of the lack of semiconductors. And
mm,
a lot of these things have now had what's happened is these things have come about because we basically have allowed our supply chains to be totally dependent on China and other countries. And when we can't get them, when we can't get things through here in here fast enough, um, the ports have been the ports have been backed up because
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
there's just, for one thing, we don't have
mm.
that many ports that goods can come into. And
So
I'm sorry,
so
go
we're
ahead.
talking so we're talking really about things that are happening in the kind of real world of stuff and not the financialized part of the
Exactly.
economy. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. That is
So
exactly it. It is they are supply problems, and they come about from many years deindustrialization and deregulation. And then also just some of it is just because this was a monumental event. And so the economy got shut down for a while. And so, things weren't being made, even though we have outsourced a lot of the production that we have in this country. We still make some things, including food. But, there's
massive food, farming and agriculture, isn't there?
Yeah, right.
So, could you tell us how that sort of influences inflation, and perhaps maybe then we can move on to talking about antitrust behavior and regulations? That is one of the areas that you're.
Something.
Oh, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Something first, which is that what we're hearing there is the complicated and fragile supply chains and supply chain problems, and of course the pandemic having an impact on people just being able to turn up to work. And to an extent, that is something which I think has affected everywhere, or almost everywhere. But there's something else, I think, in the US. I think it's a cultural issue. I think in Australia, we have very concentrated industries, including involved in food supply. But there is a different attitude towards social license to operate here. And in Australia, I think there's been much less of a tendency for shortages to drive prices up. Because I don't think monopoly suppliers in Australia have taken advantage of the opportunity to increase prices. And I think that somehow that's a more acceptable thing to do.
Yeah.
In the US, and that's part of it as well.
Yeah. And in fact, corporations, there have been comments by corporations, people within corporations, acknowledging that, in fact, what they've been able to do is take some leeway, so they have some legitimate reasons for increasing prices. And yet at the same time, what they're doing is they're bumping it up because they know that, your average person doesn't know how much their costs went up. And so they figure, well, we can get away with it. And, there was a short period of time where the pandemic did affect profits and things like that. So I'm sure that they rationalize it in terms of thinking that, well, we're making up for what we lost in the past. But, I would totally agree with you, Stephen. A lot of it is a culture. And it's a culture that has come about because we have allowed these gigantic corporations to get away with many things, and including becoming bigger and bigger and less accountable to the public.
We did I can remember back a while back, there was a similar but slightly different thing happening in Australia, where we have a kind of supermarket duopoly, I suppose you'd say. And there was a time when they got into a bit of a undercutting price war over milk. And so we were getting a litre of milk for $1, which is way, way less than it costs to actually produce and get the milk to the shelf. And people were pushing back on that. They were refusing to buy this milk, and there was campaigns to say, buy the expensive milk, don't buy the cheap stuff. Do you remember that, Steve?
That's really monopoly power pushing in the other direction.
Exactly.
They push both ways.
But it shows that people weren't going to buy into that.
I think so, but to give them, maybe the supermarkets learn from that, but to give them their credit, we've had empty shelves sometimes in this pandemic, but they have not reacted to those empty shelves by jacking their prices up.
Except for rapid antigen tests. They did it. They did with that.
Well, but that wasn't really the supermarkets, I don't think.
No.
The thing that I notice I think anyway, this is the impression I have in the US, is there are lots of businesses that have jacked up their prices by more than the increase in their costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So margins have been built,
Right.
and there's been profiteering going on.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's right, but
well, I think there has been a certain amount of that, and and I think in some ways, a lot of corporations have been doing that kind of thing in a more subtle way, even before the pandemic, because there's something you can call hidden inflation, and so for instance, companies oftentimes they start downsizing this, like for instance, you'll get cereal that maybe it was a pound box at one point in time, and then it's like 14 and a half ounces, and then it's 12 ounces. We've been seeing this kind of stuff, or
mostly air,
for quite a while. So they have been raising prices over the years, but they've been doing it in a much more subtle way, and in a way that your average person, either they don't think about it, or they just don't know. I mean, there's nothing they can feel they can do about it, and so they might complain. But now they're just being a lot more blatant because they feel they can get away with it.
Yeah.
So what could be done? What could be done about that, Sherry?
If you were in charge?
Well, if I was in charge, I think there's a lot of things I would do if I was in charge. With respect to this particular thing, as you said, Stephen, in the United States, we have commercial or corporate policies that involved what we call antitrust, but it's basically competition, controlling competition and controlling the lack of competition more specifically. And the word antitrust comes from the 1800s, when there were businesses that were organized in a way to try to take advantage of basically try to make the most out of the money that they were getting, and the structure was called a trust. And so in the US, we created a law in 1890 that was called the Sherman Antitrust Act, and so we refer to this competition policy ever since then as antitrust policy. And in other countries, they may call it, like competition policy or industrial policy or something like that. And what has happened in this country is that we have had periods when antitrust regulation kind of has ebbed and flowed. After the Great Depression, we had a period of about probably 30 years or so when we really took antitrust seriously, and like Supreme Court justices took it seriously. It was, on a broad scale, it was accepted that we did not want to have large corporations that dominated the markets. And so, but what happened was, in the 1970s, there were a lot of, economic issues that came about. And as a result of that, the thinking of, we generally refer to it as the Chicago School, but it's, because they had such a powerful influence. But so the University of Chicago had a lot of economists and lawyers and people who had a lot of influence. And so they started really promoting this idea that antitrust was really kind of not necessary. And especially they thought, well, we can look for specific things like, if we see collusion, or something like that, that's clearly illegal. But other than that, we're not going to worry about it. Well, one of the things that's most important in terms of preventing, giant corporations from concentrating is to control mergers. So when two companies want to merge, or one company wants to buy out another company, in the past, if one of the companies has say a pretty good sized market share, say they had 10-20% of the market, and the other company had a similar size, the agencies, the two agencies that are in charge of regulating antitrust, which are the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, their antitrust division, these two agencies would have prevented it, or or they may have put some certain limits on it or something like that. But since 1980,
we just don't see that anymore, do we?
Yeah, no.
Same story in the UK, where I used to live. In fact, there used to be a body called the Monopolies and Mergers Commission. It's now called the Competition Commission. The emphasis has changed.
Yeah, and the problem is the reality is switched.
That's right.
So, we live in the age of doublespeak, unfortunately.
We do.
So
we've had neoliberalism basically since then, which actually we were talking about with a marvelous group of people in Melbourne over the weekend, and what you've just described very well for us is the build up to it, or what led to, not just in the US, although probably more in the US than almost anywhere else.
Yeah.
But everyone else has shifted too.
We may have led the way, although perhaps Britain was right there along with us, because
Margaret Thatcher helped. Yes.
Yep. So and so what happened was, we had this policy of basically allowing these companies to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it has happened in every industry, and so these companies have massive market power. With that massive market power comes massive wealth. And with that massive wealth comes an ability to influence politics. And so in the end, all along, antitrust, right from the start, was believed to be, in this country, a democracy enhancing type of policy. And I think that these last 40 years have kind of proven that is a correct stance to take. So this isn't really just about economics. It shouldn't be just about economics. This is, and it's not just about equity. It's not just about economic power. It's also about being able to protect democracy from undue economic power.
And it seems to me as though Joe Biden has really not been up to that task. And do you think so? Or?
Well, I think there are a lot of movements that are positive. One thing
that's good. Yeah.
We have a woman who was appointed to the head of the Federal Trade Commission. Her name is Lena Khan, and she is very she's been very vocal and active in concern about antitrust, especially with respect to big tech. She has, she wrote a very important paper called about Amazon, and so she so that's a really good sign. And there's also some good people at Department of Justice in the Antitrust Division. Also, Biden issued a competition policy executive order last July, and his focus, he said, we're going to take this seriously, and he actually, in fact, is really focusing to a large degree on the meatpacking industry, not solely, but that is a big concern. And part of the concern is because the meat packers are making record profits. They in addition, there's only like 4 beef packing companies, and they exert a lot of power. A lot of the ranchers feel that they haven't been, getting compensated fairly. Their share of the farm dollar has continued to go down and down and down.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And so, that's a big issue.
Mm.
And
Well,
I'm sorry, our poultry industry is vertically integrated. So that's another set of problems.
Right. Yeah.
it sounds like a lot of these issues have much more to do with the jump in the cost of living in the US relative to other high-income countries around the world than federal spending or interest rates. And one of the things that's been in the news is a discussion of and some controversy about whether what people sometimes call strategic price controls might have played a role. What do you think about that as an approach to dealing with this issue?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by strategic price controls.
Well, I wasn't really either, but I'm going to forget the person's name now. There's a woman that wrote a great book about how China escaped neoliberalism, and she was advocating for what she called strategic price controls in the US. Jamie Galbraith came out and supported, of course, his father played such an important role in wartime price controls. I think Stephanie shared something Jamie Galbraith had said on the net, and Paul Krugman was initially very, very critical of the use of price controls to deal with inflationary pressures during a pandemic.
It sounds like a thing that the US would kind of go, oh, that sounds like against our freedoms type deal.
The US tends to be very negative about those kinds of things. But I think it may, in food markets, they seem to clear fairly well. I think it probably depends on the particular market. And when you're talking, I think in a lot of the discussion with respect to, if I may be wrong, but I think a lot of the discussion with respect to the argument you're referring to, did it not have a lot to do with like rent and housing? That's what I thought it was. There was some talk.
Well, that's part of it, yeah, of course, and that's something that I think Nathan Tankus has written a lot about in the past. But of course, there are price controls. In the US now, there's a statutory minimum wage. That's a price control. And in a way, you could argue that the way that the federal funds rate is set is effectively a form of price control as well. It's not as though there are no price controls. In Australia, we have regulation of companies that have very often, as a result of privatization, got monopoly power in areas which might be regarded as having public goods characteristics.
Is it Isabella Weber, the person you're thinking of?
That's the name of the.
I just looked it up.
The author.
There's a Guardian article from late December last year. If anyone wants to chase it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think when you're talking about things like housing, I mean that's a long-term problem. There are,
huge problem.
I mean, I can certainly understand why. I'm not personally against price controls or for them. I personally think it kind of depends on the situation. But I'm not sure that they are in and of themselves the solution, but they might be a temporary solution. They might be an assist for a particular, to get through a particular time until you can actually address some of the root of the problem. And so in the US, we have these cities, and they have these, it's incredibly expensive. We don't have, public housing the way we used to. And we have an incredible number of people who are now homeless. So that's a real problem situation. And I think you could have price controls that can help with that. But in the in the long run, you got to find a place for people to live, and I think it's important for everyone to have a place to live.
Of course, yeah.
We've opened up a bit of another topic here that I think it'd be really great to come back to at some stage, which is about housing and homelessness and affordable how we house people, really. And sometimes something that's quite complex actually has a simple answer. But I'm not sure if you have any last questions, Stephen, but we should probably think about wrapping up soonish.
We should, given that we have such a short show, we should have asked Sherry to come back on.
That would be excellent.
Because that's one amongst many things that it would be good to go into in more depth. Is there anything you recommend people to read or something that they should watch in order to understand the current problems in the US? We're not just talking about inflation here, and actually that's a sign of underlying problems and susceptibility to goodness knows what's happening next, another pandemic or issues relating to climate change in the future. Who should we be listening to or reading?
Well, I think with respect to antitrust and industry concentration, Matt Stoller, he wrote a book called Goliath, and that talks about the history of antitrust, and it's in the U.S. and it's a pretty comprehensive book, very interesting. He has a blog. Well, he's on Substack. And it was free. Now you do have to subscribe, but it's $5 a month. He writes about competition on a regular basis, and he really talks about a lot of really interesting things. I mean, he one of his favorite topics is a cheerleading monopoly, and it's actually really pretty interesting. But
where will we hear more from Sherry Wise as well?
Because when we were chatting to you offline, we had a great discussion about agriculture and soils and kind of the ground on which we all depend, on which we live. And I'd love to come back to that at some stage. That's something that really means a lot to me.
And I would say that, I think that climate change is starting to affect agricultural prices as well. And so, we have had some periods of like poor crops and some things like that. And so those things increase prices and lead us to it basically kind of builds up, because these, you're talking about basic crops that go into a lot of different things. And the USDA has a lot of good resources about what's going on with weather in the US, and a lot of good resources that I can point you to. And so I think it's an important discussion. In fact, USDA just announced they're going to they're going to have $1 billion to try to deal with this. So,
well, let's ask Sherry to come back on very soon and to discuss that then. That would be marvelous. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sherry.
Great chat.
It's nice to talk to you both.
Thanks. Well, it's so lovely to have you on. I hope you come back on with us very soon.
And I'd just like to, before you talk about next week's show, Stephen, I'd like to give a shout out to the lovely people in the comments here watching us live. It's great to know that you're with us in spirit, and shout out to everyone who's watching us.
Much. And next week we're going to talk. We actually started talking about it a little bit this week about what we've got planned over the next year, and outside of the Modern Money Doughnuts podcast. And
it's a big week for us.
What is driving us to do it? And then in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have a marvelous man called Randeep Ramesh, who is the chief leader writer for the UK Guardian newspaper, which is the leading national progressive newspaper in the UK, and actually one of the leading progressive papers around the world. And he's an expert in modern monetary theory. If you ever see an MMT inspired piece in the Guardian, you can be 95% sure it's Randeep that's written it. So we'll chat to him in a couple of weeks' time as well. And thanks to everybody for joining us. Thanks to Sherry again, and please stay tuned for Joe Firestone at the top of the hour.
Okay.
Excellent. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Sherry.
Bye-bye.
Steve.